what I'd call left-wing esotericist, was Charlie Chaplin, bless him, who was the tramp of the unemployed, the down at heels, the got nothing but my cane kind of characters of the American Depression. Charlie Chaplin was on the left politically. He was born in London into a very poor family, but he worked his way up through his skill as a performer, as an artist. And he mesmerised Hollywood by making these great films, which were all political. They're about the poor and how the common man can win against a system that's corrupt and oppressive. And in Modern Times and other of his great movies, he exposed in The Great Dictator the nonsense of Hitler. I just watched that movie recently. It's a black and white film where a Jewish guy who looks like Hitler gets mistaken for Hitler, and it's a great pastiche, a kind of a tragicomedy. So anyway, Chaplin was very important in his day, in my parents' day. What's interesting is that there's a museum dedicated to his work called Chaplin's World. Eventually, he took a stand against the persecution of communists by the American right-wing governments in the Cold War. As an icon of the left, the moderate, intelligent left in America, and the right under McCarthy, who were then making it criminal offence to have ever been a member of the Communist Party, or kind of sympathised with them. Chaplin made a movie about that and exposed the stupidity of it. But then he himself was hauled before the Committee of Un-American Activity. What they called this was, if you were like a cosmopolitan thinker like Picasso or Marx himself, you were un-American, right? So you can imagine in Brexit Britain there'll be a sort of a Congress, a parliamentary committee of un-British activity. If you do too much thinking or visit the Pyrenees or study philosophy or read Kant or Hegel or Marx, you'll be, hauled up. Well, Chaplin was hauled up before this committee, and it was a disgraceful thing. And he refused to answer the questions like, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? Do you sympathise with them? Instead, he left the country. He said, I'm not going to live in that barbaric country anymore. And he moved to Switzerland. He was a European. He was a left-wing wisdom worker who used film and cinema. And he ended up in a little town called Coursier-sur-Vevey, which is in French Switzerland. And his house is now a great museum, Chaplin's World. It's the only Chaplin museum in Europe. And so, great man, a lot of work. There's a very important biography about Chaplin called Chaplin, a Political Biography. The author's gone into all this in huge detail, and his stand in the Cold War for the right to be left-wing. It was becoming dangerous to admit to being left-wing. Being left-wing, as far as I can work out, just means you're on the side of the poor. Well, on this planet of 6 billion people, there's about 5.75 billion poor. There's a very small number of very rich people who are organising fake wars and creating a sort of media takeover so that they show us stuff that makes us all terrified, we're afraid of our neighbours, we're paranoid, so they can go on doing these wars, and they create the enemy image of Islam, or, if you're, there are right-wing anti-Semites who think Jews are responsible for everything that's going on in the world. So, everybody's terrified of everyone else. What Chaplin was saying is, if we work together for the common man, as Roosevelt had said, we can bring peace to this planet. And that, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out that should be the position of the 5.75 billion people on this planet. That's what we need to come together and do. And I think there's some very interesting history here in the Pyrenees, because the Cathars were on the side of the poor, actually, as had Jesus been. Although they had patrons who were quite wealthy, on the whole, the Cathars were not millionaires. It was the guys in Rome sending the armies that were. Anyway, so lo and behold, I've discovered something very interesting. There's an amazing researcher here I hope to invite next year called Patricia Chaplin, who was married to Charlie Chaplin's son. And she has become a real dedicated esoteric researcher here in the Pyrenees. She's from London, she's a playwright in her own name. She's written many novels, and research books about the Rennes-le-Château mystery, she's traced it back to Girona, which I mentioned earlier in my talk yesterday about the Jewish mysteries of the Kabbalah. What Patrice Chaplin has discovered is that Girona, the Kabbalistic capital of the world, where Nachmanides came from, who then went to Jerusalem, had this sophisticated mystical tradition, which the Cathars had also got. There was correspondence between these Cathars and Kabbalists, and that it lived on in secret in Girona. And she herself has met people that are still practicing these esoteric mysteries. And she thinks, she's written books proving, I suspend judgment, that Bérenger Saunière, who was the guy that, was so important in Rennes-le-Château, actually had connections with Girona. And he's discovered that he probably had like a partner or consort in Girona. And she believes that she's traced the family tree back to his son. So there's links between Rennes-le-Château and Girona. She wrote about this in a book called Happy Hour, which was about life in, it's one of those, it's not a novel, it's like Holy Blood and Holy Grail. It's one woman's adventure in search of the truth about all this. And she's done tremendous research, and there she is, from the Chaplin family, carrying on with this, if you want, left-wing esotericism, oriented towards peace. She's also written a book more recently called Lucifer by Moonlight, carrying on with this research. I mean, this woman is a genius. I look forward to meeting her. I hope she'll speak for us next year. Amazing work she's done. Okay, so moving on. So what about Marx himself? Was he ever here in the Pyrenees? He went with his daughter, Eleanor, to a lot of spas. They used to go, towards the end of his life, when he was getting a bit ill, they'd go to a spa and take the waters, and he went to Malvern and other places. I think he might have come to the Pyrenees, but I think I once read a reference to it. I couldn't find verification. What I do know is that at least two of his daughters were in Paris at the time of the Paris Commune in 1870, and when the Commune collapsed, they had to flee from France in fear of their lives because the right-wing government that destroyed the Paris Commune with fire and mortar were coming to kill them. Paul Lafargue got out, and these Marx sisters, Paul was married to Laura Marx, and they fled across the Pyrenees. And there's a heroic story of how these Marx children, the daughters, who are now political activists on the left in their own right, have been through the Paris Commune, had to flee, ended up in a little village here in the Pyrenees, and they tried to get across the border. They did get across the border, but then they were promptly arrested by the Spanish police at the other side, and they were then charged. The French right-wing government then said, these people are the dangerous daughters of the most radical socialist in the world, Karl Marx. You shouldn't let them go, whatever you do. And people were writing telegrams. Marx had sent them letters on how to escape. And eventually they were let go by the Spanish government because they hadn't really done anything. They'd not been involved in the fighting in Paris. They'd fled. And it's interesting that Eleanor, who was known as Tussie, the youngest of Marx's children, who was here in the Pyrenees, she later moved from London down to Brighton and worked as a school teacher. And I grew up in Brighton. She lived in what we call Montpellier in Brighton at 6 Vernon Terrace. She was an active intellectual socialist, inherited from her father a passion for literature. She could quote whole Shakespeare plays and worked through the pen, which is mightier than the sword. So, next point I want to come on to is witchcraft in the Pyrenees. Were there witches here? Where are they now? Yes, there were witches here. It's a very interesting history. I've discovered that somebody has done a PhD thesis at the University in Barcelona, who's a medievalist, and he's done a thesis about the very first examples of the persecution and killing of witches in the whole of Europe took place here in the Pyrenees Mountains. An exhibition has been organised locally about this in the Anu Valleys in Catalonia, which is just across in the Spanish part of the Pyrenees. And the curator of the exhibition, Paul Castel, has said, based on his thesis, that the first people accused of witchcraft in the whole of Europe were here in the Pyrenees. Most often they are accused by their neighbours, and 90% of them were female, which means 10% were men. So the Pyrenees is important in the history of witchcraft for that reason, and I have many, Wiccan friends and scholars, and I run the Pagan Academic Network in Europe and Britain, and I've done conferences and so on pagan scholars trying to recover this lost history, because witchcraft has a right to be there, I think, along with all the other great spiritual traditions of humanity. Wicca's an interesting contemporary or modern revival of the most ancient traditions, and very similar to Druidry. A lot of Druids and Wiccans are, the same thing, like Janus, different faces. So this chap deserves to be commemorated because he's done his research based on records he's discovered in the archives of the investigations into these witches. I wrote, and I've been in correspondence with him, I'm hoping he'll talk next year at our conference, whether any of these witches ever invoked Mary Magdalene for protection. And in fact, he hasn't found in the archives any examples of that. But what he's found is that there were sometimes prayers invoking Mary Magdalene. So, that's interesting. Okay, I want to move on and look at the history of Islam in the area and Sufism, because that's obviously one of my interests as a religious scholar. Andalusia was Islamic, and Sufis and intellectuals of the Islamic community, especially in Cordoba, but all over, there were some very, very great thinkers here in Seville, Granada, Cadiz, and so on, and in Cordoba. And they had brought the texts of Aristotle translated into Arabic, and Ibn Rushd in Cordoba. They were doing advanced scholarly research when this had all been lost in Britain and Western Europe. So scholars who are interested in wisdom come through the Pyrenees down to Spain to study at their feet. Even Abelard was in correspondence with people studying in Cordoba, who were looking beyond outer religious differences, Islamic, Jewish, Christian. No, let's go for truth. Let Nachmanides sit down with Abelard and sit down with Ibn Rushd and find an ultimate common truth. Who is that Lord of Light, that is the good Lord, that should be the source of the religion of love that we all should be following. Anyway, apparently these early Muslim thinkers helped found the University of Montpellier here in France, in southern France, not far. It was founded partly by Muslim scholars and became one of the great centres of medicine in the whole of Europe, because the doctors of Islamic Spain were experts in herbal medicine, the physiology of the body, the circulation of the different parts of the body, and pharmacology. They had translated Dioscorides and all the great Greek medical sciences. Aristotle they loved because he was a medical thinker at the end of the day. His father was the physician to the king of Macedon. So many of the gardens were medicinal gardens, and in Montpellier, just down the road from Bugarach here, is the oldest pharmaceutical garden in France, planted at the time of the university with medicinal plants. Plants are our medicine. We don't need the rich pharmaceutical companies to tyrannize us and tell us what we can and can't use. If you are knowledgeable about plants, you can treat people as a doctor. And this is what's been found. One of our English scholars, Adelard of Bath, 1080 to 1152, came down to Spain to study with these great Muslim thinkers. And he introduced numerals. The mathematical system we use in the West is based on Arabic numerals introduced by people like Adelard of Bath and others. So I've mentioned what the Pyrenees were doing in classical times. The Greeks built a great colony at Marseille. They traded. There are Greek temples found. near Girona, interestingly enough, was a port called Ampurias, which was a Greek foundation. In the southwest part of the city were many temples to Artemis. There was a temple to Asclepius, the god of medicine for the Greeks, and a temple to Zeus Serapis. So the Greeks were here, with their philosophers, with their sages, and with their medical traditions in Girona, which later influenced, I think, why Girona became such a flourishing centre of learning. And the Romans kept this port going, Ampurias, and they built a great temple to Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. Jupiter, the god of the universe, Juno, his wife, and Minerva, the goddess of wisdom. So great stuff. Then we have the Visigoth period. Very important Visigoths. They were Germanic tribes who'd converted to Christianity, but of an Aryan kind, A-R-I-A-N. And they didn't believe in the official Trinity. They believed that God's complexity cannot be easily summed up, even in a Trinity. And that Christ was a human, like all of us, but could channel or download the cosmic wisdom, as have and can many prophets and sages. They had obviously a very interesting take on all this. Unfortunately, their records, their archives have been lost, but it's said that Rennes-le-Château was a Visigoth foundation, and that it's speculated, because they were the people that entered Rome in 410, it's called the Sack of Rome, by Catholic authors who are very anti-Arian, so they make out they were working for the devil and it was all a tragedy. But maybe the Arians, their history needs to be told. They didn't destroy all the churches, they were quite respectful. And they brought some treasure with them when they left Rome. Speculation is that it was the temple of Jerusalem's treasure that the Romans had captured 400 years previously. Ended up buried somewhere near Rennes-le-Château. I mean, that's the legend. Maybe really it's a legend about wisdom that had been transmitted. It's the Aryan Christian wisdom that then becomes symbolised at Rennes-le-Château, which is merged with Girona, which Patrice Chaplin has been finding out about. And that's the greatest treasure that any of us can have, is truth and true wisdom. We as a planet are dying not for lack of money, but lack of wisdom. There's a truth shortage on this planet, and we can't develop a peaceful world unless we get truth back out. And that is, it's been thousands of years overdue. And the importance of figures like Christ is they represent a sort of sudden truth explosion in history. And I think these Vandals and Visigoths respected that. But they were too militaristic. And, I don't agree with warfare, obviously. Okay, moving on. And Val Wynyard, who lives locally, has done a lot of work on the Visigoths that you can look at. Just to finish, where are the universities in the Pyrenees? Why isn't there one? Well, there are. There's a university at Montpellier, the oldest in France. There's an important university in Toulouse. There's a university in Pau, which is up in the Pyrenees. They're all active and doing important stuff. In Spain, across the Pyrenees Mountains, there's the University of Navarra, which is a not-for-profit private university founded by Opus Dei, by Saint José María Escriva de Balaguer, who is the founder of Opus Dei. They do a lot of interesting work. The University of Andorra exists. That's a small little principality up in the High Pyrenees between France and Spain. And there is a university in Girona also, which recently gave George Steiner his honorary PhD. George Steiner, great Jewish intellectual, one of the polymaths of our age. I'm hoping my daughter will go and interview him in Cambridge before he dies. Like Walter Benjamin, who died trying to get over the Pyrenees, George Steiner survived the war because his father had the intelligence to get him out of Paris and take him to New York. George Steiner represents that universality that I think the Pyrenees does at its best. And I hope that in my talk I've given you a glimpse of that world, that cosmopolitan intellectual vibrancy that the Pyrenees region represents. It's a frontier land, and it is the mountains of Heracles, left for love. You know, that's why I published the Love Journal. What is the mystery of love? Did Mary Magdalene, Jesus himself, some say, eventually take refuge here? Who knows? These mountains are the mountains of love. And what we need is a world free of war, a world free of violence, and a world in which peace is, the temple of Pax is again reopened, not just in Rome, but in all the cities of the world, and in all our hearts. So anyway, thank you for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed this little mini conference on esotericism in the Pyrenees. And I've given you what's basically an overview, a sort of eagle-eyed journey across. But you can research yourself, and we hope to do another conference next year. Thank you so much.